What exactly is that smell? Did someone let livestock into my cabin? She didn't even bother to close her book. Captain Ronald Mercer's towering figure loomed over seat 2B, his shadow cutting across the open pages like a blade. The atmosphere in first class instantly turned to ice. 12 passengers collectively glued their eyes to their screens, their laps, their own hands, looking anywhere but at the only black woman on the flight. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice was low, terrifyingly flat. "I'm talking to you." He pointed fingers at her, like a meter maid writing a parking ticket. "Who upgraded you?" She slowly looked up. No panic, no flinch, just a long, unblinking stare. The kind of look that should have been a dead giveaway to anyone with half a brain. "I bought my ticket." Mercer let out a judgmental sneer, making sure his voice carried across the entire cabin. "Right. Another frequent flyer mile scam. It's always the same, always trouble. Your people always find a loophole and try to squeeze through it like a slow leak rotting a house." He talked about her as if she weren't even sitting there, like she was a mechanical glitch in the aircraft's design rather than a flesh-and-blood human being. What Captain Ronald Mercer didn't know, what was about to completely dismantle his 23-year career over the next 14 days, was that he had just spat those words directly into the face of a sitting federal judge. From the exact moment he opened his mouth, every single word became state's evidence. Let me tell you how that verdict actually began that morning. 5:43 in the morning. Charlotte, North Carolina, a pale blue house on Elmwood Drive, with a porch light still on. The Honorable Vivienne Cole sat at her kitchen table, with a legal brief she didn't need to read. She knew it by heart. She'd written the opinion herself. She was reading it again anyway, the way a pianist plays a piece before a concert. Not because they've forgotten it, but because the act of preparation is itself a form of respect. She was 51 years old, 17 years on the federal bench. Before that, 8 years as a federal public defender. Before that, 3 years at the Justice Department in D.C. Before that, a clerkship with a Supreme Court justice that most law students spend their entire careers dreaming about and never reaching. Her name was on 3 landmark civil rights rulings that were still being argued in law schools. She had accepted a keynote invitation from a legal symposium in Memphis and decided, at the last minute, to fly alone without her clerk, without her security detail, without the small administrative apparatus that usually announced her arrival, like a ship's bow wave. She opened the kitchen drawer, looked at her court credentials, her federal ID, the laminated card with the seal. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put it back, closed the drawer, grabbed her personal wallet, Virginia driver's license, 1 credit card, her Skybridge Airways loyalty card, platinum tier. She'd been flying since before most of the people on that plane were born. She didn't need the credentials to prove who she was. That was the decision she would replay, over and over, for the next 11 days. Her phone rang. It was her clerk, Marcus Webb, 28 years old, first-year clerk, still occasionally astonished that his phone number was in the contacts of a federal judge. "Judge Cole, are you sure you don't want me to ride out?" The symposium coordinator said they'd arrange a car from the airport. "Marcus." She pulled on her coat. "I've been flying alone since before your parents met. Take the weekend." "Yes, ma'am." "And stop calling me ma'am on weekends. We've discussed this." She heard him laugh as she hung up. She picked up her carry-on, slim, black, no logos, and walked out the door. Now let's talk about Ronald Mercer. Same morning, Charlotte Douglas International Airport. The pilot's lounge at Gate D. Mercer walked in like a man who had been rehearsing his own importance since childhood. Silver at the temples. Jaw like a ship's prow, the kind of posture that said, "I have been doing this longer than you have been alive, and I want you to feel that every time you look at me." 23 years with Skybridge Airways. One commendation plaque he kept on his desk at home. Not at work, at home, so he could look at it from the couch. He told the same 4 stories about his career at every social gathering for the past decade, and had genuinely begun to believe they were interesting. His first officer, a 32-year-old woman named Diane Lark, was already at the table, reviewing the flight manifest on her tablet. She'd been flying with Mercer for 18 months. She had learned in that time exactly how much hot space to leave around his ego, the way you learn to leave a cracked window near a gas leak. Full flight, she said. First class has a platinum loyalty block. Mostly full fare. Mercer poured himself coffee without looking at the pot. Platinum. Half those upgrades go to people who don't know the difference between a dinner roll and a bread plate. He sat down. The real flyers know how to act. Diane said nothing. She tapped her screen. She had a performance review coming in 6 weeks, and Mercer was one of 3 signatures on it. This is not the same as agreeing. This is survival arithmetic. And sometimes the math runs out. Mercer scrolled through the manifest. He wasn't looking for names. He wasn't looking for special dietary requests or medical notes. He was doing what he always did. He was looking at the seating chart and making calculations that had nothing to do with aviation. Gate D17. The boarding area was ordinary Tuesday morning geography. A man in a khaki blazer, reading the Wall Street Journal. A couple in matching fleece jackets comparing phones. A woman in her 70s, knitting something blue. And Vivienne Cole, in seat 2B, reading a copy of a Supreme Court opinion she'd been meaning to finish for 3 weeks. The gate agent, a young man named Travis Okonkwo, 24, 6 months on the job, scanned her boarding pass and said, "Welcome aboard, Judge Cole. Enjoy your flight." He said it because the loyalty system flagged her title in her profile. He didn't know it was going to matter. He was just doing his job correctly. That sentence, that completely ordinary, professional, 15-word sentence, it would become evidence. Vivienne settled into 2B. Window seat. She stowed her carry-on, smoothed her slacks, opened her book. She was wearing a dark gray blazer over a cream blouse. No jewelry except small pearl studs her mother had given her on the day she was sworn in. Nothing expensive, nothing loud. She looked like a woman on a Tuesday morning flight. And that, for a man like Ronald Mercer, was the entire problem. The cockpit door opened at 7:19. Mercer walked into the first-class cabin for his pre-departure greeting. He did this on every flight. It was his signature, his theater, the moment where 23 years felt like 23 inches of height advantage over everyone in the room. Row 1A, white man business suit, laptop bag. "Morning, sir. Great day to fly. We'll get you there on time." Handshake, eye contact, full wattage smile. Row 1C, elderly white man, bow tie, reading glasses perched on his forehead. "Welcome aboard, sir. Let us know if you need anything." Another handshake. Row 3A, white woman, corporate blazer, already on a call. He mouthed sorry to interrupt, gave her a thumbs up, moved on. Row 4A and 4B, young couple in matching jackets. First time flying Skybridge? Nope. 15 years. He practically lit up. 15 years. That's what I like to hear. We'll take good care of you. Then row 2. Vivienne looked up from her book. The smile didn't disappear. It curdled. That's the only word for it. Like milk that's gone 1 hour past its moment. His hand stayed at his side. He didn't offer it. "May I see your boarding pass?" Vivienne held up her phone. The digital pass was right there. Her name, seat 2B, first class, platinum tier. Gate scanned and confirmed at 6:47 a.m. Physical copy? It's digital, as it says on the screen. He stared at her for a beat that lasted longer than it had any right to. The kind of stare that does 2 things at the same time, measures you and dismisses you, and is designed to make you feel the measurement as an insult. Then he walked toward the forward galley without a word. No welcome, no handshake, No, let me know if you need anything. Every single white passenger in that cabin had received a warm greeting. The two black passengers, Vivienne in 2B and an older man, Reverend James Pickett, 71, in seat 1D, received nothing. That is not an oversight. That is a pattern, and patterns are the architecture of accountability. In the galley, Mercer pulled the lead flight attendant, a woman named Sandra Cho, aside. He kept his voice low. Not low enough. The woman in 2B. Did that come through as a loyalty upgrade, or was it full fare? Sandra checked the system. Tapped twice. Full fare, Captain. Platinum tier. She's been a Skybridge member for 19 years. Mercer said nothing to acknowledge this. Not a nod, not an okay, not a correction. He said 4 words that Sandra Cho would repeat verbatim in a recorded interview 7 days later. Watch her closely today. No reason, no security flag, no policy basis. Watch her closely today. And Sandra, 14 years of service, trained to defer to the chain of command, nodded. She didn't push back. She didn't ask why. She added Vivienne Cole to an invisible watch list that had been built on nothing except the color of a woman's skin at 37,000 feet, with no accountability mechanism in sight. The flight leveled out. The seatbelt sign clicked off. Sandra began the first-class service. Row 1A. Champagne, hot towel, warm almonds in a ceramic dish. Row 1C, champagne, hot towel, almonds. Row 3A, champagne, hot towel, almonds. Row 4A, 4B, same. Row 2B. 22 minutes passed. 22 minutes after every other first-class passenger had been served, Sandra finally appeared at Vivienne's row. No champagne, no towel, no almonds. What would you like to drink? Sparkling water, please. Sandra brought the water, set it down without making eye contact, moved on. Vivienne looked at the glass. Then she looked at the empty tray table beside it, where the warm almonds were not. She pressed one finger to the center of her palm and held it there. Then she opened her book to page 94 and went back to reading. She had been a federal judge for 17 years. She had sat across from men who lied to her face in open court. She knew what erasure looked like. She'd been recognizing it since she was 9 years old. What she was doing in that seat was not passivity. What she was doing was memorizing. Every timestamp, every face, every word spoken, and every service withheld. The architecture of what was happening was already being filed, methodically, in a mind that had built federal cases from thinner material than this. The cockpit door opened again. This time, Mercer didn't greet anyone. He didn't pause at a single row. He walked the length of the aisle with the focused energy of a man who had already made a decision and was now executing it. He stopped at seat 2B. He stood close, closer than he needed to. His shadow fell across Vivienne's book again. I'm going to need a government-issued photo ID, physical. Now. Vivienne set her book down on her tray table. She did it slowly, spine down, page marked. She looked up at him. You did not ask anyone else in this cabin for identification. I'm asking you. On what grounds? Security concern. The cabin was no longer reading. The man in 1A had turned sideways in his seat. The couple in 4A had stopped talking. Sandra, standing near the galley entrance, had gone very still. A security concern you cannot name, Vivienne said, targeting the only black woman in first class. That is what you're describing. Mercer's jaw moved. Ma'am, if you do not comply with a crew security request, I am authorized to have you removed from this aircraft. The silence that followed was the kind that has physical weight. You could feel it pressing on the overhead bins. Vivienne looked past him, down the aisle, for exactly 3 seconds. Every pair of eyes slid away from hers. She turned back to Mercer. She understood the math. She had been understanding this particular math her entire life. She opened her bag. She took out her North Carolina driver's license. She held it out. He took it from her hand, like he was inspecting a document at a border crossing. He held it up to the overhead light, turned it sideways, held it at an angle. Her photograph, her name, her address, valid, current, matching the boarding pass, the manifest, the gate scan, everything. There was nothing wrong with it. And then, without a word, he pressed both thumbs along the center, and he snapped it in two. The sound was small and precise, like a twig breaking underfoot in a quiet forest. He dropped both pieces onto her tray table, next to the sparkling water she'd been given in place of champagne. "What is that odor?" He said it loud now, no longer a galley whisper, no longer a murmur. He said it for the cabin. "Did someone bring livestock into my cabin?" Not one person spoke. You people always find a way to crawl into places that were built for better. I don't know how you got through that gate, but when we land, I'm handing you to airport security. You want to sit in first class? Fine. You'll sit in handcuffs. He straightened his jacket. He adjusted his epaulets. He walked back to the cockpit like a man who had just resolved a maintenance issue and was ready for his next task. The door closed. Nobody breathed. Reverend James Pickett, 71 years old, seat 1D, had his hands flat on both knees. He had been a minister in Richmond, Virginia for 41 years. He had marched. He had buried children killed by violence. He had preached in front of governors and sat in holding cells. He had seen, in 7 decades on this earth, nearly every shape that cruelty can take. But he had never seen a uniformed pilot snap a woman's identification in half in front of a full cabin and dare the room to say a word. He said quietly, but so that everyone could hear, "Captain, that woman has done nothing wrong." The intercom clicked. Mercer's voice came through the ceiling. "Sir, please remain seated. This is a security matter." Reverend Pickett looked at the intercom speaker like he was looking at the man himself. "I know a security matter when I see one," he said, "and I know when I don't." In seat 3A, a woman named Catherine Marsh had stopped typing the moment Mercer walked out of the galley. Catherine was 44, a civil litigation attorney who had been practicing law in Phoenix for 16 years. She had never met Vivienne Cole. She didn't know Vivienne's name, her title, or her profession. She only knew what she had seen, and what she had seen was something that, in her professional estimation, was going to matter. She opened a new note on her phone. Her thumbs moved fast and clean. 7:52 a.m. Captain approaches 2B. No greeting given at boarding. Demands boarding pass, not requested from any other passenger. 7:53 a.m. Captain returns from galley. Demands government-issued physical ID. States security concern. Provides no basis. 7:54 a.m. Passenger in 2B produces North Carolina driver's license. 7:54 a.m. Captain snaps license in half. Places both pieces on tray table. 7:54 a.m. Captain makes the following statements verbatim. "What is that odor? Did someone bring livestock into my cabin? You people always find a way to crawl into places that were built for better. When we land, I'm handing you to airport security. You want to sit in first class? Fine. You'll sit in handcuffs." 7:55 a.m. Captain returns to cockpit. Catherine Marsh had built evidence packages in asbestos cases, securities fraud cases, wrongful termination cases. She knew what a contemporaneous record was worth in a discovery request. She didn't know she was building one for a federal judge. She was building it for the woman in the gray blazer, who had not made a single sound when a man destroyed her property and threatened her in front of 12 people. Some people cry when they're being mistreated. Some people argue. Some people freeze. Vivienne Cole pressed her fingernail into the wooden armrest, looked at the 2 pieces of her license on the tray, and very slowly picked up her book again. Page 94. She read the same paragraph 4 times. She wasn't reading, she was working. In the cockpit, Diane Lark had heard everything through the door that was open a crack. She heard the snap of the license. She heard the words livestock and handcuffs and you people. When Mercer settled back into his seat, Her hands stayed exactly where they were, on the controls, because they had to. But something inside her chest changed its position, the way furniture shifts in an earthquake. Ron. Her voice was flat. Careful. Handled what exactly? She had a valid boarding pass, and she, Diane. I am your captain on this aircraft, and I am telling you it is handled. Do not make this into something it isn't. Diane Lark did not speak again until they began their descent into Memphis. But for the remaining 49 minutes of that flight, something had been decided inside her that no one had yet asked her about. Flight 247 touched down at Memphis International at 10:17 in the morning. The seatbelt sign chimed. Passengers stood, reached for bags, returned to the ordinary rhythms of Tuesday. It was not ordinary. Nothing about the next 14 minutes was going to be ordinary. Sandra Cho appeared at Vivienne's row before she could stand. Her hands were clasped in front of her, the way people hold their hands when they are following instructions. They're not sure they should be following. Ma'am, the captain has requested that you remain seated until ground security can meet you at the gate. Vivienne looked at her for a moment. On what grounds? Vivienne asked. I'm only relaying. I know what you're doing. Vivienne said it with analysis. And I am standing up now. She pulled her carry-on from the overhead bin, straightened her blazer, and walked off that plane with her spine exactly as straight as it had been when she boarded. Not fast, not slow. Exactly the pace of a woman who knows she is entirely in the right and is in no hurry to pretend otherwise. At the end of the jet bridge, 3 people were waiting. A Skybridge ground supervisor, a Memphis airport security officer, and a second officer who looked like he'd been told this was something it clearly was not. The supervisor stepped forward, sweating visibly through his collar despite the air conditioning. Miss, I'm sorry, we didn't get a. The captain flagged a concern about travel credentials, and we just need. Your captain destroyed my state-issued identification during the flight. Vivienne's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He made racially derogatory remarks in front of a full first-class cabin. And before we landed, he radioed ahead a false characterization of this incident to justify having me detained here. So I would like the name of your head of internal affairs, a printout of the captain's in-flight incident report, and the direct number for your airline's legal department. Those are the 3 things I need from you. The supervisor's mouth opened and stayed open. The security officer looked at the other security officer. Neither of them had any idea who she was. All they had was what Mercer had called in from the cockpit during taxi. Passenger in 2B. Non-compliant. Possible fraudulent documentation. Combative behavior. Potential federal security concern. 4 descriptors. All 4 of them lies. They walked her to a small holding room near the operations center. Gray walls. Fluorescent lights that hummed at an almost subliminal frequency. A folding table and 2 chairs that didn't match. The kind of room that is designed to make you feel like a problem. Vivienne sat down, not because they asked her to, because she chose to. They asked for another form of identification. She reached into her bag, removed her U.S. passport, and placed it on the table. They ran it through the system. 13 seconds. The supervisor stared at his screen. He turned it slightly, as if showing it to someone else who wasn't there. He cleared his throat. Everything is completely in order, Miss Cole. I apologize for the inconvenience. We were just following the captain's. I'd like those 3 things now, Vivienne said. The incident report, the name of your head of internal affairs, and the legal department number. Long pause. I'll need to make a call. Please do. She got to Memphis 2 hours and 40 minutes late. The symposium organizers had sent a car that waited without complaint. She gave her keynote with the precision she always brought to it, and the 400 lawyers in that room had no idea what had happened to her that morning on the way there. She didn't tell them, not yet. That night, alone in her hotel room, Vivienne Cole sat on the edge of the bed in the particular quiet that only comes after a long day of performance. She reached into the pocket of her blazer and pulled out the two halves of her North Carolina driver's license. She held them together, edge to edge. Her own face split down the middle, her name in two pieces. A thing that had cost her nothing to have and had cost him so little to destroy. Her hands did not shake. That was the remarkable thing. Her hands did not shake because she had long since learned to put the shaking somewhere it could be useful. She called Marcus Webb. He answered on the second ring. Because she had been his judge for 11 months, and he had learned that when her number appeared at night, something important was happening. She told him everything, systematically. The boarding pass check that didn't happen to anyone else, the service delay, the ID demand, the snap, the words specifically. She recited them from memory in the same tone she used to read case citations. When she finished, Marcus said nothing for 6 full seconds. She could hear him breathing. "Judge Cole, I need to make several calls." "Marcus." This is not about the title. A federal officer was targeted, degraded, and had government-adjacent documentation destroyed by a licensed commercial pilot who then filed false information in a federally regulated incident report. That enters a different channel than a standard passenger complaint. "You know that." She did know that. "I know," she said. "Are you okay?" She was quiet for a moment. "I will be when this is done." Marcus Webb was on the phone until 1 in the morning. The first call went to the clerk of court. The second went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Charlotte. The third went directly to the Department of Transportation's Aviation Consumer Protection Division. The fourth went to an attorney Boyd worked with at the Justice Department, who specialized in federal civil rights enforcement. The machinery did not make noise when it began to move. That is one of its properties. It is absolutely silent at the start. You only hear it when it arrives. Monday morning. Skybridge Airways headquarters, Nashville. Margaret Haas, Vice President of Internal Affairs, walked into her office at 7:09 with a cup of coffee and a schedule full of routine compliance reviews. By 7:23, her entire week had been restructured by forces she hadn't seen coming. 2 items were waiting on her desk, delivered by the overnight courier system. The first was a formal passenger complaint, filed online at 11:52 Sunday night by one Vivienne Cole. It was 5 pages, single-spaced, time-stamped to the minute. It included a complete service log, noting what every first-class passenger received, and in what order, a verbatim transcript of every word spoken by the captain, a list of witnesses with seat numbers, and a scanned image, 2 pieces of a North Carolina driver's license, arranged side by side on a flatbed scanner with ruler markings along the edge. Margaret had worked in airline complaint resolution for 11 years. She had read thousands of passenger complaints, people writing in capital letters about cold food, people misremembering flight numbers, people confusing their upgrade category with their seat assignment, and making both errors feel catastrophic. She had developed a very precise internal calibration for the difference between a complaint and a case. This was not a complaint. This read like a federal filing, because the woman who wrote it had written hundreds of them. The second item was a letter. Official United States Department of Justice letterhead, routed through the DOJ Civil Rights Division, addressed specifically to Skybridge Airways, Internal Affairs, and Legal. Margaret read it once, then she read it again. Then she stood up and closed her office door and stood in the center of the room for a moment before sitting back down. The letter did not threaten. It was in the specific way that federal attorneys communicate when they want you to understand the exact scope of your exposure, without raising the temperature in the room. Informational. It stated that the Honorable Vivienne Cole, United States District Court Judge, 17th Circuit. A federal officer with 17 years on the federal bench and current active clearance had been subjected to discriminatory treatment, verbal abuse, racial degradation, and the deliberate destruction of her personal identification documents by a Skybridge Airways captain during Flight 2247 on the preceding Tuesday. It noted that the matter fell within the potential purview of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, FAA regulations governing crew conduct and passenger treatment, federal statutes governing the false reporting of incidents on commercial aircraft, and federal law pertaining to the destruction or interference with government-adjacent identification. It requested full cooperation with the review. Margaret Haas picked up her phone. Direct line to CEO Warren Blaine. Warren, we have a situation.
What kind?
The kind where a captain with 23 years of service snapped a federal judge's driver's license in half in front of full first-class cabin and then filed a false incident report, calling her combative. And then the Department of Justice sent us a letter about it on DOJ letterhead. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that has dollar amounts inside it. How bad? If the FAA opens before we act, if the Civil Rights Division escalates, if this reaches a congressional inquiry, we're looking at a level of exposure I don't have a framework for. Ground him, today. Full investigation, everything documented, every witness, every page, already started. Who is she, Margaret? Federal District Court judge. 17 years on the bench. She sat in that seat, let him tear her ID in half, and then went and gave a keynote to 400 lawyers like it was just Tuesday. Warren Blaine exhaled, long and slow. He picked the wrong passenger, Warren. Margaret's voice was careful. He picks passengers the same way he's been picking them for years. What's different this time is that this passenger had a bench. That same afternoon, Ronald Rajund Mercer was in the garage of his house in a suburb of Nashville, polishing a set of golf clubs he'd bought himself for his 20th anniversary with the airline. He was proud of those clubs. He was proud of most things that reflected his own good judgment back at him. His phone rang. Skybridge Human Resources. Captain Mercer, this is Linda from Employee Relations. Effective immediately, you have been placed on administrative leave pending a formal internal investigation. You are directed to surrender your crew credentials to your base manager within 24 hours and await contact from Internal Affairs. He laughed. He actually laughed. For what? Because a passenger filed a complaint. Captain Mercer, I'm not at liberty to discuss the specifics, but I can tell you that the passenger in question holds a federal judicial appointment. The matter has been formally referred to the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, and the FAA has been notified of the incident report discrepancy. The golf club in his hand became suddenly, inexplicably heavy. I don't. That's not. You'll receive written notification by end of business today. Do you have any questions about the administrative leave process? He didn't answer. He was trying to reconstruct her face, trying to remember if there had been something he'd missed, something she should have said, something that should have told him. But there hadn't been. She'd handed him her ID. She'd watched him break it. She'd picked up her book. She hadn't said a single dramatic thing, hadn't made a scene, hadn't announced herself. He understood, finally, what that silence was. It was not what he'd thought it was. The investigation file grew faster than anyone expected. Catherine Marsh's contemporaneous record arrived electronically, formatted with timestamp headers and direct quotes, 4.5 pages. It was, in the opinion of the investigator who received it, the most meticulously constructed eyewitness account she had seen outside of a courtroom deposition. Reverend James Pickett sent a handwritten statement in blue ink on lined paper, 6 pages. He described, in the language of a man who had watched history from a front row he didn't choose, what he had witnessed on Flight 2247. His final paragraph read, I am 71 years old. I have been searched, followed, questioned, and moved aside in airports since the year Nixon was in office. But I have never seen a uniformed captain destroy a woman's identification in front of a cabin full of people and then dare the room to breathe. That was not security. That was a demonstration. I have seen demonstrations before. I know what they are for. 7 of the 12 first-class passengers provided written statements. 6 confirmed that only Vivienne Cole had been asked for identification. 5 confirmed the exact phrasing of the captain's words, including livestock and handcuffs. 3 specifically noted Sandra Cho's failure to intervene. The man in seat 1A, the first person Mercer had greeted with a handshake and a smile, submitted one line. I sat 4 feet away and I said nothing. I will have to live with that. Diane Lark did not wait to be called. She submitted a voluntary recorded endorsement statement on day 3. Before anyone told her she should, before her union rep advised her anything, before there was any framework for what she was walking into. She said she had heard the words through the cockpit door. She described the comment about loyalty upgrades in the crew lounge. She described Sandra being pulled aside. She described the 2 words Mercer had said when he sat back down. Handled it. That was the phrase. Like he'd cleared a jammed galley door. Sandra Cho's interview was harder. She read with her hands folded in her lap, and she kept them there throughout, like she was holding something down. The investigator walked her through the service log. You served every other passenger in first class before row 2B? Yes. You gave champagne to seats 1A, 1C, 3A, 4A, 4B, but not to the passenger in 2B. Yes. Did Captain Mercer instruct you to watch the passenger in 2B? Sandra's hands tightened. He said to watch her closely. Did he give a reason? No. Did you ask for one? Long pause. No. And when he snapped her license in half, Sandra looked at the table. I was standing 12 feet away. What did you do? She didn't answer immediately, and in the space where the answer should have been, the investigator wrote in her notes, "Witness confirms visual. No intervention taken." The investigation interview with Ronald Mercer took place on day 9. He arrived with a union representative and an attorney. He was dressed carefully, as if clothing could counteract documentation. The swagger that had defined him in every crew lounge for 23 years had been replaced by something tighter, the posture of a man trying to hold the shape of authority he could feel collapsing. I've flown 23 years, he said before anyone asked him anything, not a single sustained complaint. Margaret Haas opened a folder. You have 4 prior complaints alleging differential treatment of passengers based on race. 2015, 2017, 2019, 2021. Each was closed as resolved without investigation. All 4 have been reopened. His attorney put a hand on the table. Mercer's jaw went still. Margaret read his incident report aloud. The words non-compliant, fraudulent, documentation, combative behavior hung in the air of the conference room like smoke. Let's go through these. She handed over her ID when you requested it. She questioned my authority. Is a question non-compliance? No answer. You wrote potentially fraudulent documentation. Her full-fare first-class ticket was gate-scanned at 6:47 a.m. by the boarding agent. The system shows a clean read. What was fraudulent about it? She had no physical boarding pass. 63% of Skybridge passengers board with digital passes. Did you ask any of those passengers for a physical copy? No answer. You wrote combative. Describe the combative behavior. She had an attitude. Margaret placed 8 documents on the table in front of him. The gate scan log, Catherine Marsh's contemporaneous record, Reverend Pickett's statement, 5 passengers' statements, the 2 halves of the driver's license in a sealed evidence bag, Diane Lark's voluntary deposition. 6 witnesses describe a passenger who spoke calmly and complied with every request. 0 witnesses describe combative behavior. Your incident report describes the opposite of what occurred. Explain the discrepancy. Mercer's knuckles were white around the water glass he hadn't drunk from. I have a responsibility for the safety of every person on my aircraft. Something doesn't fit. I act. What didn't fit about Miss Cole? 5 seconds of silence, then 8 seconds. His attorney touched his arm. He stopped. What? He couldn't finish it. Not in a room with a camera running and a court reporter at the side table. But the unfinished sentence did more damage than any completed one could have. She just didn't look like she belonged. That was it. That was the security concern. That was the 23 years of authority, the 4 commendations, the ghost of a handshake photograph that used to hang somewhere important, distilled to its actual content. She was black. She was a woman. She was in a seat he had decided was not built for her. And he had used everything his uniform gave him to make her feel that. Margaret read Diane Lark's statement into the record. The crew lounge comment, the pull-aside with Sandra. The 2 words at 10,000 feet over Tennessee, handled it. Mercer's face went flat. He hadn't known Diane had talked. The co-pilot he had managed and evaluated and scheduled for 18 months had chosen, when the moment came, to tell the truth. Not to him, to the record. And the record did not misquote and did not misremember and did not care about his commendations. The board's ruling came on day 14, 6 executives, 1 outside counsel, 1 FAA regulatory liaison, the evidence file 81 pages. The deliberation took less than 90 minutes. Captain Ronald Mercer was found in violation of 4 separate standards. 1. Skybridge Airways' passenger dignity and non-discrimination policy. He had singled out the only black woman in first class for targeted challenges, degradation, and public humiliation with 0 documented basis. He had given every other passenger in that cabin a personal greeting while giving her nothing. He had then escalated the targeting across the duration of a 2-hour flight in deliberate, sequential steps. 2. FAA-mandated crew conduct standards. He had used his uniform and his authority to intimidate and degrade a passenger in a manner unrelated to aviation safety by any interpretable standard. The FAA liaison stated for the record that the incident report itself constituted a potential violation of federal regulations governing truthful documentation on commercial aircraft. 3. Filing a materially false incident report. Non-compliant was refuted by gate scan records and 6 independent witnesses. Fraudulent documentation was refuted by the same gate scan records and the boarding system. Combative was refuted by every single person in that cabin who agreed to speak. Filing a false incident report on a commercial flight is not a paperwork error. It is a federal matter. It is the kind of matter that an FAA hearing examines line by line. 4. Destruction of a passenger's personal property. He physically broke a valid North Carolina driver's license in half in front of 12 witnesses in a federally regulated transport vehicle. There is no Skybridge policy, no FAA regulation, and no federal statute that gives a pilot the authority to destroy a passenger's belongings under any circumstances. This alone, in the FAA referral, would be sufficient to trigger a fitness review. Termination, effective immediately. 23 years. Gone. Not taken from him by a rival, not erased by time, not lost to circumstance. Ended by his own hands on a Tuesday morning over a seat that was never his to police. The FAA's independent investigation opened within 72 hours of the referral. The false incident report alone placed his pilot's certificate in jeopardy. The review would take months, but the direction of it was not ambiguous. When you document your own misconduct in a federally regulated incident report, you have built the case against yourself. You do not need a plaintiff. You have already provided the prosecution's Exhibit 1. Sandra Cho's ruling came the following day. 90-day suspension without pay. Mandatory retraining in civil rights compliance and bystander intervention protocols. The investigation found she had failed her duty under Section 14 of the Skybridge Crew Conduct Standards, the section that required her to report discriminatory conduct by any crew member, regardless of rank. She had witnessed Mercer snap the license. She had heard the words. She had done nothing. She had then, at Mercer's instruction, delayed service to the targeted passenger and relayed his instruction to detain her at the gate. Sandra signed the ruling without appeal. She took the 90 days without contesting them. Whether she spent those days defending herself or sitting with what she should have done differently, that was between her and the kind of quiet that only comes when you stop moving long enough to let your conscience catch up to you. The airline's internal audit, triggered automatically by the complaint, uncovered Mercer's 4 prior discrimination complaints. All 4 had been routed through a supervisor who had been Mercer's former co-pilot. All 4 had been closed in under 48 hours with no formal investigation. 3 of the 4 original complainants were located and contacted. 2 agreed to speak on record. What they described, in their own words, from their own flights, in their own voices, was not a man having a bad day. It was a man with a method, a consistent, practiced, 2-decade method of using the authority of a cockpit to make certain passengers feel like intrusions. Skybridge announced a comprehensive policy reform. All crew-initiated passenger identity challenges must now be logged in real time, with a documented basis visible to the operations center before the challenge is made. No more verbal directives that disappear into the air. An independent ombudsman position was created to handle all discrimination complaints outside the crew hierarchy. Implicit bias training became mandatory and annual for every crew member, every employee who interacts with passengers, and every supervisor. Any incident involving destruction or confiscation of passenger property triggers automatic investigation. No supervisor discretion, no quiet resolution. CEO Warren Blaine issued a public statement that ran in 3 major newspapers and led 3 airline industry newsletters. The words were chosen carefully by a communications team and a legal team, but the last paragraph was his own. It read, "We cannot undo what happened on Flight 2247. We cannot give back the 2 hours Judge Cole spent in a holding room that she did not deserve to enter. But we can make a promise, backed by policy, backed by accountability, backed by the willingness to be audited publicly, that we know what was wrong, and we will not pretend we don't." Vivienne Cole filed a formal civil rights complaint with the Department of Transportation. Skybridge settled. The amount was not made public, but the terms were a formal written apology to Vivienne Cole, to Reverend James Pickett, and to each passenger on Flight 2247 who witnessed what happened and carried it with them off that plane. An independent 5-year audit of Skybridge's discrimination complaint resolution process, published publicly every year on the airline's website, accessible to anyone, and a scholarship fund in partnership with 3 historically Black law schools, seated at $3 million for students pursuing careers in civil rights and aviation law. Attached to the front page of the settlement, as Exhibit A, were 2 halves of a North Carolina driver's license. The laminate cracked down the center. The photograph split in 2. A document that cost $9 to replace at the DMV and had proved, in the end, worth considerably more than that. And here is the part that people only learn if they follow the story far enough. Ronald Mercer's FAA hearing took place 4 months later. He arrived with 2 attorneys. He sat at the respondent table and watched a hearing examiner read his own words back to him from the incident report he had filed from the cockpit of Flight 2247. Non-compliant, fraudulent, combative. The examiner read them slowly, with the particular precision of someone who has read a great many documents and knows exactly which words carry the most weight. Then the examiner read Diane Lark's deposition. Then Catherine Marsh's, then the gate scan log. Then Reverend Pickett's handwritten statement, all 6 pages, in the voice of a man who had been watching this country practice and fail and practice again for 71 years. At the end of the hearing, the examiner looked at Mercer over his reading glasses and said, "Captain Mercer, in 29 years on this panel, I have reviewed cases involving drunk pilots, cases involving falsified medical records, cases involving gross mechanical negligence. In all of those cases, the respondent had made a mistake they were capable of understanding was a mistake. What troubles me about your case is that the record does not show a mistake. It shows a decision, a deliberate, sequential decision made over a 2-hour flight, using the authority of your uniform and your rank, against a woman who had done nothing wrong. That is not an error in judgment. That is a choice, and we revoke licenses for choices." Ronald Mercer's commercial pilot certificate was suspended for 18 months, with conditions for reinstatement so stringent that 2 independent aviation attorneys privately told him not to bother trying. He lost the credential he had spent his entire adult life accumulating. The commendation plaque that had been on his desk at home was still there. He didn't move it immediately, the way you don't immediately clean up after a flood, because for a while you're still hoping the water will go back down on its own. One Tuesday morning in January, 4 months after the hearing, he was sitting in that same garage. The golf clubs were still there. He picked one up and put it back down and sat on the workbench for a long time. His wife came to the doorway once and said nothing and left. He did not know if he would ever fully reconstruct what had gone wrong. Not the legal reckoning. He understood that, but the interior architecture of how a man gets to the place where he snaps a stranger's license in half and calls it security. He had always believed that what he was doing was maintenance. Maintaining standards. Maintaining order. He had never once asked himself, whose order? Built on what? Maintained for whom? These are the questions that don't arrive gently. Vivienne Cole returned to her courtroom on a Wednesday. She walked through the courthouse at 7:51 a.m., nodded to the bailiff, accepted her coffee from the clerk's office, and settled into the bench for a 9 o'clock calendar call. 63 motions, 2 trials starting Monday. 1 sentencing she'd been preparing for 3 weeks. Marcus Webb stopped her in the hall before the morning session. He was holding a letter. This came registered mail. "I thought you'd want it before you went on the bench." It was from Reverend James Pickett, handwritten, blue ink. "Dear Judge Cole, I have waited a long time to see the kind of accountability I witnessed in this case. My generation marched for it, we sat for it, we bled for it, and for most of my life I watched it arrive too late or too partially or not at all. What you did was different. You did not march, and you did not shout, and you did not beg. You sat in your seat and you let the system do its worst, and then you used every instrument that same system gave you to make it answer for itself. That is a kind of dignity I did not know I would live to see. God bless you, Vivienne, and God bless the young ones coming up behind you who will sit in that seat and find it just a little less cold than it was when you sat in it." Vivienne read it twice. She folded it carefully along the original creases. She walked to her chambers and pinned it to the corkboard above her desk, next to the seating chart from Flight 2247 that her clerk had printed from the airline's records during the investigation. 63 motions on one side, 1 handwritten letter on the other. Both were evidence. Both proved the same thing. The work is the point. Not the recognition, not the title. The long, patient, precise, exhausting, necessary work of holding systems accountable, especially the systems that decide without asking who belongs and who doesn't. 3 weeks after the ruling, Diane Lark flew her first flight under a new captain. When they reached cruising altitude, she unbuckled her seatbelt, stood up, and walked into the first-class cabin herself. She went, row by row, every passenger. She introduced herself, made eye contact, asked if there was anything they needed. She didn't make a speech. She didn't explain herself. She just made sure that every person in that cabin had been seen by someone in a uniform who was genuinely glad to see them. Nobody asked her to do it. It wasn't in the new policy manual. She just decided that on her flights it was going to be different. That's a small thing. It's also the only way anything ever actually changes. Not in boardrooms, not in settlement agreements, but in the individual decision of one person in a cockpit choosing to be different on the very next flight. So let me ask you something. Before you move on to the next thing, if you were on that plane, not the judge, not the reverend, not the attorney in 3A with the legal pad on her phone, just you in your seat watching a man in a uniform break a woman's license in half and call her livestock in front of 12 people who all went silent, what would you have done? Would you have spoken, like the reverend? Would you have opened your phone and started writing, like the attorney? Or would you have looked at your screen and told yourself it wasn't your business? There is no easy answer. But there is an honest one. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this story stayed with you, if it made you angry, or hopeful, or uncomfortable, or all three at once, hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that dignity is not a credential. It's not something you earn by sitting in the right seat or carrying the right badge. It is the one thing no uniform gives anyone the right to take. Subscribe if you want more stories about people who refuse to disappear. Ring the bell, because the next story is the one sitting in the seat right next to this one. Justice doesn't always arrive on schedule, but sometimes, it arrives in seat 2B.